Let's go back to basics. Is spanking an acceptable form of discipline?
I want to try to find some space for spanking.
Hi, I'm Andy.
And I'm Roger,
And welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics.
On our search to find the middle.
We're going to give you last week's news today.
It's a slogan we should put on the t-shirt.
Stop touching her!
I am tonight announcing my candidacy.
Taylor Swift.
Look, my biggest issue with marriage is that I think that it's a fundamentally flawed institution that is built on the oppression of women.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny.
Having truly rational conversations about controversial issues is risky these days.
Andy, how you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. How did you cope with the conclusion of the Bruce Lerman, Brittany Higgins civil case?
Yeah, I actually don't know how I feel. It's a fatigue that I felt when it was the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp saga as well, where the whole thing lasted so long and there were so many iterations that I kind of just tuned out, and then certain headlines grabbed you, but it was clear that I was missing certain bits and pieces.
I just hope we don't have a Netflix special delivering the blow-by-blow account.
Well, given that it's a civil case, you can do anything's on the cards, right?
So what you think Bruce Lerman's going to do an O.J. Simpson, God rest his soul, and write a book, If I Did It?
There was shady stuff left, right and centre, and yeah, you just left feeling very weird about the whole thing. I think a lot of people would take what they want to out of that. They're always looking for their whatever supports their hypothesis and their leanings, right? So I can't remember who I was talking to, but I had an acquaintance who is a bit of a men's rights activist, and he was like, look, see, the judge literally said that Brittany Higgins showed no sign of verbally or physically stopping the act of sex happening. So it only meets the definition of rape by the very new standards of active consent, which is bullshit. And so I think everyone gets what they want to out of it, right? Like whether you really hate him or you love, you want to support him or support his ideals or whatever. It's just a lose-lose for everyone, I think.
I actually listened to the verdict, streamed it. I don't know why.
Oh, really? I thought you couldn't stand this stuff.
No, I can't, but it was just one of those situations where they were like handing down the verdict, and it just... Anyway, it went on for much longer than I was expecting, so I gave up. But at least some part of it that I did listen into, it was interesting to hear the judge basically actually slam everyone as being really bad and deplorable. Yeah. But the one thing that made this different to any other case of this nature was that, like, Brittany Higgins and her current partner and then Channel 10 and Lisa Wilkinson, the whole thing was very contrived, like it was very strategic, and it was all about how can we use this to inflict the maximum pain, like politically, and how can we leverage this? And it was just like that. I think that's the bit that I think under different circumstances, the community would be like, this poor girl who's had this really terrible, horrible thing happen to her. But I think where this got a bit really murky really quickly was where it was there were other motives and other dimensions brought in, and it still does, that bit still doesn't sit well with me, if I'm honest.
Can I ask you something controversial?
Of course, it's the middle.
Now, there was that case of, I think it was a Judge Lindsay Kushner, who kind of doubled down on this stance that, like, the fact that women get so blind drunk is making it impossible to get these convictions to stick, right? And she got blasted for victim shaming, victim blaming, all this kind of stuff. I'm going to read her words here and let me know what you think. So she says, girls are perfectly entitled to drink themselves into the ground, but should be aware people who are potential defendants to rape gravitate towards girls who have been drinking. It shouldn't be like that, but it does happen, and we see it time and time again. What are your thoughts about that line?
Well, if it's a statement of fact and truth, well, it probably is, right? That's probably what happens in reality, right? Should it be that way? And is that victim blaming somehow? Well, I think it's a little bit like saying that to the extent that you can do things within your locus of control that will protect yourself and reduce your exposure to risk, then it's in your interest to do those things. It's just a statement of that. It's like saying, if you don't want to get mugged or you don't want to get into trouble, don't walk in, on certain streets late at night on your own when there's no one else around that are known to be dangerous, right? I mean, for men and women, so not just women walking on certain streets at night. You might have this high and mighty view that, oh, well, I should be entitled to walk wherever I want. It's a public street. It's my right to do that, and so I should be able to do that. How dare you suggest to me that I shouldn't do that, or I should think twice if I'm going to do that?
Yeah.
Of course, like, we all do that. Like, we make good decisions that are in our own best interest all the time. And there was an interesting kind of line from the judge in this case around how when people get really drunk, unless you're with them for an extended period of time, they can be like reasonably well functioning or pass off as being reasonably well functioning, even though they are actually quite intoxicated. And you might be able to tell they're drunk, but you may not necessarily know how drunk they are, or you may not have a good sense of the extent to which their judgment is impaired, or they do or can or can't consent to things. So the only thing I will say about that in its totality is just simply that at the end of the day, this stuff's really complicated. And the judge did make the point this is a civil judgment, so it wasn't to the standard of criminal proof, which is beyond reasonable doubt. And I think this is where, like, to get to the criminal standard of beyond reasonable doubt, it's these sorts of questions which would come up.
It's a really good point, right? Like, and I think you don't have to go further than your own experience around yourself being drunk at one point or another. That you kind of know, like, there are times where you think you have it together, and then half an hour later, you are on a rocket ship to Mars, right? That really complicates things. But obviously, in this case, there's a lot more evidence that we're not across, and you just have to take the judgment for what it is. But yeah, everyone comes off with a bit of dirt on them, unfortunately.
So the other big piece of news this week was a little bit traumatic, which was the stabbing. Actually, not sure the total number of people who were actually stabbed in Bondi Junction, major shopping centre here in Sydney. But 6 people did lose their lives from this incident. And I think for many people, this resonated in a way that other, maybe incidents of this nature, because it was at a shopping centre, it was very random. Most people, like, if you're in Australia, most people will have a regular experience of going to a shopping centre like a Westfield Bondi Junction, which is where it occurred. And this is like a weekly, event for most Australians in one way or another. But also just the horror of it, right? That, everyone's got smartphones and they're filming it, and you see people sort of running around confused, not knowing what's going on. Then they're filming the attacker, and he looked a bit crazed as he was, and then even the horror of, a baby being stabbed, for example, and the mother dying, and, really quite horrific. So I think we did just want to also acknowledge that. And in fact, I think we were sort of having a bit of a text exchange around the time, and we were sort of wondering, is this like terrorism? Because we've got the whole Israel-Palestine situation and so on.
It's a truly shocking event, right? So absolutely horrific. And I think that, you don't have to be a father or a mother to just understand how incredibly tragic, the situation where a mother is protecting a 9-month-old baby, and both are stabbed. The baby is stabbed in the arm and the abdomen, and the mother dies, a 38-year-old mother and a 9-month-old baby in hospital recovering. There are not too many other details you need to know to have it really affect you and move you. Definitely the question that always comes to my mind is why. Like, you always search and grasp for some kind of order in the chaos, and in the end you really just know you're not really going to get it. And I think that's what we were talking about actually at times during our exchanges, that this guy's dead, so he was shot. The only way he was stopped on his rampage, he was shot by a police officer, and there are no answers to be had, not for the victims, not for most of Australia. And it's just a very unsettling moment in time.
I think, first of all, that cop, a lone female cop, I mean, she's female, but I mean, she's a cop, so I don't know that that's necessarily.
She got a pink gun.
I don't think that's necessarily part of the relevant part of the story, but nonetheless, a lone solo female cop running around this shopping centre on her own. This crazy guy with a knife, to apprehend him, I do think this is we've on this podcast, we've talked about, police and sort of how they kind of just don't do anything, right? Like their job is de-escalating and it's wholly unsatisfying until you have a situation like this happen. And they are trained, they're professional, they put their lives on the line, and they bring home the bacon when they have to. Yeah. And that cop, I don't know what the awards are, Order of Australia or whatever, but she's got to be top of the list. But and you're right too, around your point around, we don't know what the cause is, why, and all of that stuff. And I think this, like, honestly, I think what's a little bit hollow about this is I actually do think this is a shit happens scenario. It's been discussed about how mental health and, schizophrenia and so on was involved. It's not believed that there's any kind of, this guy's doesn't have any extreme ideological background, like not a terrorist. It does appear he did attack women predominantly, but we don't know. And so I think his parents were in the, in the media as well. It seems that they're good, upstanding members of their community as well. And I sort of wonder sometimes with these things, do we actually want it to be some terrorism? Like is there something hollow about it being the equivalent of a car crash, right? As opposed, an accident, right? As opposed to someone's caused this, in this way that they can be blamed for it.
So I think that the only thing about it being, like you said, a car crash or whatever, I think in the back of people's mind is like how many people out there in society are capable of this. I think it's worth mentioning too that we have had a bit of a barrage here in Sydney, so there's been a bit of a spate, closely not linked, but it just hot off the heels of the Bondi Junction stabbing, there was also a terrorism incident of a stabbing at a church that was also a knife crime, and that one was deemed a terrorism act. But and there's been a few other little more minor knife crime incidents, all coupled within the last 7 days. So I think that there's this general feeling of vulnerability for people living in New South Wales at the moment, and it's one of those situations where you just find it hard to reconcile with the everyday experience of being an Australian.
One thing I do want to call out though is what I think is a really bad take on this whole thing, right? And it was almost probably inevitable when there was some clear targeting of women involved. Like, I think there was one male security guard officer that was murdered, but the rest were all women. So it's sort of inevitable that this line was gonna come out. But this notion that men must do more, men must get better.
Oh, I haven't heard that one.
Now, I'm sure all of the people who've been sort of saying this, and these are our political leaders saying this, right? They say it in a very, a nuanced way. So I don't want to kind of sort of like put words in anyone's mouth, but there's definitely this notion that this is another example of male violence against women, as though, and I kind of look at that and I go, that's not the right take for this, right? To somehow suggest that, well, we're obviously two blokes, here today, but the suggestion that you or I somehow have to take ownership of this and that somehow there's part of this that's, as men, that, we've got to take on board this, more than anyone else, and not just sort of place this as what it is, which was an unwell man who maybe had things going on that did something not good. And
no, I mean, I haven't heard that one, but horrible take, inappropriate in every single way. And yeah, I hope that's the response, right? That's just disrespectful to everyone saying that.
Well, so just to be more specific about it, this is an article from, so this is Friday the 18th of April, an article from the Sydney Morning Herald. Attorney General Mark Dreyfus will call out a crisis of male violence in Australia and demand that men step up to prevent it after the number of women killed in violent incidents so far this year reached 24, including 5 in a stabbing rampage at Sydney's Bondi Junction last weekend. So that's the sort of the byline of the article. So he might be saying something more nuanced than that, but I think to to kind of use this as the platform to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that.
Obviously, it's like you do hear that line, especially around domestic violence. It's like, men do better. It's like, oh, okay. Now that you've put it that way, I won't go home and, destroy my family and then commit suicide. Thanks for telling me that. It's, it makes you wonder whether there's this idea that all men are on this sliding scale towards violence. And the reality is, it's like, it's way, except for an all-out apocalyptic wartime environment, something similar to The Walking Dead, most people, like, there are serious binary elements that are going on that would allow someone to behave in that way, usually through mental health. So, yeah, it's a very misguided kind of message to put out there.
Yep, I agree. So this episode, we're going to actually touch on some of the more controversial decisions that parents have to make, and particularly where there might be different views among different parents and different parenting styles and philosophies of parenting. And just before we begin, though, because I think we usually have some sort of a pre-conversation about like what we're going to talk about in an episode, and you raise this, I think it's an author, or anyway, I don't know much about this person, but do you just want to set it up and give a little bit of context, and then we'll get into the thrust of the episode?
So this is not going to be an episode purely about Abigail Shrier, but she has been doing. She's written a new book recently, and she's a kind of, I suppose, an author that talks about some social issues. And she famously had a book around the dangers of the transgender movement quite a few years ago.
I knew you were alt-right.
And it was sufficiently loaded enough that even Jordan Peterson himself was a little bit scared to go there after coming back, re-emerging. And it's bad when Peterson is worried to touch it. But she has recently released a new book, and the book is called Irreversible Damage. And essentially in that book, there are a lot of themes that she brings up, but one of the main ones that is doing the circuit at the moment on the podcast circuit and the author circuit is really challenging this idea that we are raising a generation of children that are incapable of being set up for success in the new world, so that they're riddled with anxiety, they don't have the resilience needed, and they can't cope with failure. And some of the arguments that she raises in this is that actually it's our fault as parents, because we have given away our power, our authority, and kids are going into counseling at a really young age and in really large volumes, and it's becoming this idea that as a parent you no longer have the authority or the capability to even help your own kids. You have to always hand it over to the experts, right? And so it's really this idea that and caught up within that there are flavors of traditional families falling apart and things of that nature. So she can be kind of put into that conservative category when it comes to family values as well. But it raises a lot of interesting topics for discuss in terms of parenting that we've talked about on this show as well.
Yeah, so I have some time for this sort of a conversation and discussion. Like, I don't know that it's necessarily the experts part of it, like as in that people are outsourcing parenting to experts and not therefore somehow they're relieved. And I don't know fully like the thrust of what she's saying, but if that, like, I'm sure there's more nuance to it than just how I've kind of painted the picture. But I actually think it's more like, for me, what resonates is the notion of not standing up to children, like sort of almost like adults, the adults in the room kind of, too scared to kind of be firm adults and parents, as opposed to just bending over backwards to meet whatever will and need a kid has. And I do think that does have impacts. We're going to repeat a format that we used in one of our other recent episodes. We've got 10 questions, and you don't know the questions, but I've got the list in front of me. I'm going to read them out.
I'm always
one by
best
one.
Off the cuff.
And you're gonna tell me your views and your answer to the 10 questions. So
I'm feeling
and
very
we'll go from
reactive
there.
already, though, Andy. So just keep that in mind. That from that listener question, I still haven't recovered. So I'm very triggered at the moment. But I just before you start off, I will just apologise. I think I got the names wrong for the book. So Abigail Schreier's original book was Irreversible Damage, which was in reference to adolescent onset gender dysphoria, so all the trans issue. And her new one that's doing the circuit at the moment, which is called Bad Therapy. And that's about the fact that all the things that we spoke about just then around parents and their power and outsourcing to experts.
I think there's a bit of novel dysphoria going on between those two titles there, but let's get into the questions. So, number one, is it okay to let a 10-year-old ride on the subway alone?
We've infamously had this discussion before on the show, and I think that we use the New York City kind of subway as the benchmark for this. And famously, you know, that the mother that wrote the article for their child traveling on the subway as a form of empowerment and learning and growth for the child. My views haven't changed on the fact that that is unnecessary risk and just a really flippant way of trying to introduce unknown challenges to your child. I still stand by my comments that I think it can really be done in a more controlled way where there is, there's less risk. And to me, it just reeks of someone trying to overcompensate or go against the grain so that they can tell someone that they've done it rather than actually benefit from the experiences for their child.
So I'm going to have to disagree with you again, as we did, I think, in the original episode. There's lots of caveats around all of this, and I'm sure on both sides, on your side too. For me, the caveats would be, yes, okay, you know, maybe not at 11 o'clock at night, and maybe not, you know, in some of the more dodgy areas or whatever. But the question, literally as it stands, is it okay to let a 10-year-old ride the subway alone? Let's just take subway to include any kind of mass transit system anywhere in the world. So we're not necessarily talking about a specific subway system that's notoriously dangerous or anything like that. Then, yeah, absolutely, it's okay to let them ride it alone. But do you have some guardrails? Well, yeah, of course you probably do. You might make sure that they're competent. You might make sure they're doing it at a time when there's lots of other adults and, you know, decent people around. There might be some other things you tell them not to do. And I can actually say now that I've been every morning putting my son on the train to get to school. So he's not quite 10, he's actually 11. So I don't know if that changes that as an example, but to be honest, I'm quite comfortable doing that, and it's fine. Everything goes okay. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think it's not about going on the subway just for shits and giggles, right? It's for a purpose, and yes, it's okay.
Well, let's pause there, right? And you brought it up. So with your son, you're letting him ride the train because it's required, to me, what's relevant here is the purpose. You're not solely basing that fact on him riding the train to gain some kind of experience in the world, to become streetwise and confident and all this kind of stuff. And I think the spirit of that particular article in New York City or whatever it was more about that, right? There's no reason why that child had to do that. It was more just purely for that point, right? And I think that, you know, if your child, your boy is 11, he's going to school or whatever it is, that's part of the routine. And it's not, you're not, or maybe you are, I don't know, maybe you can talk about it, but I don't think you're thinking this is going to be a developmental thing for him.
Okay, well, let me address two parts of that. The first is the New York example. And so for anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about when we talk about this, there was a parent who let their child ride the subway, and I can't remember exactly the context. Did they write an article about it, or there was some way that this came to light or something, and it was this big controversy, and she was, you know, hounded as being irresponsible or whatever. But I'm not sure that the pure essence of that was I just want you to go and do something dangerous to make you more responsible, right? I think the essence was, in this city, New York, riding the subway is going to be a part of your life. It helps you get around. It helps you go whether school or, whatever your things that you go to every day. It helps you go to all your extracurricular activities. It helps you get to your friends' house. Like this is a city relying on public transport. So the sooner you can, be taught how to use the subway, there is a functional benefit. So I think that's very much would have been the motivator. I don't think, someone from, the outer suburbs that doesn't need train would have, I'm going to drive you into New York City and get you to, ride the subway, Like I think it was like a functional reality of living in that city. But I don't want to dwell too much on that, and we should skip to the next question in a moment. But I do just want to touch on then, how does this then relate to, is there a development goal here? And absolutely, yes, there is. Like, I wouldn't be saying to my son, get the train if he didn't need to get the train to school. So absolutely. But having the opportunity, like I could drive him to school every day, but I'm deciding not to do that. I'm just like, no, I don't want to drive him to school every day. I want him to catch the train because not only is it a little bit easier for me, but it's not impossible. But for me, it is actually like a good positive developmental, goal and outcome that he can do those things. So yes, there's a practical reality to it, but also like it is actually beneficial that he can do that in its own right.
Yeah. And look, we're talking about a sliding scale here. The original thing that was in debate, it was clickbaity as all hell as well, right? Like it was clearly an ideological thing to sell a story. Like the headline was, I let my 9-year-old ride the subway alone and I got labelled the world's worst mum. I founded Free Range Kids, a movement to get parents to let their kids go. It's great for children, but society hasn't gotten the memo. Like, come on. That's what I'm talking about, right? That you're acting like people never grow up to know, if I don't do this now, they're never going to grow up to learn how to use the train. Like I just think that you can get carried away with this stuff.
I think what we're talking about here is society changing in that, I was getting the train, if not the train, certainly I was walking around the suburb on my own. I was going to parks myself on my own when I was much younger than what kids are allowed to now. And then equally, I remember my parents telling me stories about how they used to, do all sorts of weird and wonderful things independently when they were growing up. And that's changing. And kids are allowed to do less and less and less. So I think when someone sets up a movement called Free Range Kids, it's not that they're saying, oh, let's let kids do whatever they want, right? And go off and it's actually a rebuff to this tendency to wrap kids up in cotton wool and not let them do anything, right? So that's what I think that's coming at from. Like that's where it's coming from. It's not like we're just going to let them take risks for the sake of it. It's a rebuff to. It's actually more just saying we just want to keep doing what we've always done and let our kids be a bit independent by the age of 9 or 10, right? As opposed to lock them up and they can't do anything unless their chauffeur comes and coddles them and holds their hand, right? I think that's what it's getting at. So I'm for it. I would support it. I would support that movement.
Yeah, look, we disagree on this one, and I'm happy to disagree. I think that, and in general, I find that there are different attitudes that this is actually one of those racial divides as well.
Well, let's move on to the next hot topic. Number 2, should parents monitor their teenagers' social media accounts?
Well, you're going to have to deal with this before I do. Well, girls tend to kind of go into this space a bit earlier, so maybe not. When we were kids, or when I was a kid, I had an interest in technology. And my parents were technophobes. And the only reason that we even bought a computer was because of me, right? So the resulting environment was one of total control because my parents didn't even know how to turn a computer on, let alone monitor my usage. When I think about my own experiences, I do think that I would not want that for my children. And I know it's a different time now, and it's not so easy to separate technology and the good and the bad parts of it. But for those reasons, I can't imagine myself just trusting totally to confidently say to you, I would never dream of, monitoring usage. I don't think I'd be able to say that to you for that reason. And I know that there's a lot of bad actors out there, and it's one of those things. You can trust your kids. You can try to set a strong enough foundation that you hope that they do the right thing and are able and equipped to deal with sticky situations. But the truth is that they're still growing, and it's a wild world out there. So I think that I would have some level of monitoring and control.
All right. Well, my answer is I would sub in a different word. So it says, should parents monitor their teenagers' social media accounts? That to me is a little bit too Communist Party surveillance state-ish style. But I would say yes to monitoring social media usage. And the difference for me would be I wouldn't necessarily want them to show me exactly like your chat history with some friend, right? That to me is a bit too invasive and a little bit probably crossing a line, because we're talking teenagers, so I think they're old enough to have an independent life. So I think they should be entitled to that. I think that's actually their right. And we might not like it as parents, but I think actually as a human being, it is their right to have some privacy. But usage, I would say, if you're making sure you have a good handle on who they're talking with, how they're engaging with them, maybe just being aware at a higher level sense, some of those questions. And if you're totally unaware, then maybe you need to have some conversations with your child. But if you think you've got a pretty good idea, I don't think that entails, and indeed, probably the two go together. Once you feel like you've got a pretty good idea, you don't feel like you have the need to read their messages.
It's so tough, because even as you're saying that, I'm nodding my head. I'm like, yeah, you can't be going through message trails and things like that. But if you don't know who that person is, right? Like if you draw a comparison into the real world, if you knew your child's friendship circles and who they're friends with, and then all of a sudden, Manuel comes along and you don't know who this person is, you find out that he's actually 32 years old and whatever, I'd be asking to see that message, you know what I mean? Sorry to defame Manuel, anyone called Manuel, by the way. I'm sorry about that.
Just as an aside, I think if parents can be really naive, I think, and as teenagers once ourselves, and you gave your story about the computer and how you knew it but they didn't know it and what was on it or whatever. But just think about this for a second. You don't see your children, if they're school aged, pretty much most of the day. They are on their own in the playground, in the classroom. They're doing all sorts of stuff that we don't know about. And don't think it's all that innocent just because it's at school, especially high school. I think primary school's pretty innocent, but
yeah,
once they get to high school, or they're making their own way to and from school, or they're talking with their mates, there's a lot of stuff going on in that world that we've got no visibility over, and it's probably best that we don't have visibility over it. But to think that for the 1 hour that you cross over at home when they're not, when they're on their phone, right? They're on their phone for an hour at home, that's somehow where the big disaster's going to come, and you need to be there to protect them from it. I think that there's a bit of naivety to that view. Let's move to the next one, which I think kind of links to this in some ways. At what age is it appropriate for children to have their own smartphones?
So I think the age that you think it's the right time is one marker, is one goalpost, and then the age where it becomes a social cost to your child not to have it is the other side of the goalpost, right? And I know this from my daughter she just got her ears pierced on her 8th birthday. And I thought to myself, no way, this is stuff that she should be doing when she's, a teenager. The reality of her social situation was that the girls in her group, they already had it done, and not only had just had it done, they had it done, their ears pierced years ago, right? And so, like I said, it starts to become a little bit of a social cost. And yes, you shouldn't always just do things for social reasons and peer pressure. But at the same time, it is very hard. If you're going to let someone have that thing, that device, that piercing, whatever it is, at some point in time, it then starts to become this like really academic thing around, oh, well, what's the difference between now or in a year's time or 18 months' time or whatever? And every parent has to decide that for themselves. So I think that's the kind of landscape I'd like to set. Now, saying all that to give you a straight answer, I would preferably love to hold it off until they are 13 years old. That would be my ideal. I think by that time you're well into establishing your space in high school and you're able to kind of understand the nature of, you know, the responsibility of these social connections a lot better than, say, a primary school child would be able to do. So that would be my straight-laced answer, given all my provisos.
So I would say that I think the longer you can wait, the better. But I do think there are some reasons why that might be a little bit less straightforward as it might seem to be. So, well, maybe to address the elephant in the room, because my 11-year-old has one. Predominantly the reason he's got one is because, like we discussed before, he's getting the train. So we didn't want him doing that without a phone. So that's why he has one. But at the same time, lots of his friends have them too. So it's not there's nothing novel or unique about him having one. And I would say probably half-half. Half have them at his age. Half have them, half don't have them. And it's the beginning of... He's in year 6, so it's the beginning of year 6. I would be surprised if between now and the end of year 6, a majority of kids didn't have a phone. And then certainly by like starting high school. So I think that will probably be like the reality is that most 12-year-olds, 11 or 12-year-olds entering high school will have a phone. And they will be somewhat the odd one out if they don't. And that does kind of then raise other issues, like exactly what you said. Like, is there a peer cost to them not having one? I think it's probably different for boys and girls too. So for boys, I think the social media side it's like a little bit like connected into kind of gaming adjacent things like Discord, which is a chat thing that they use, and they don't just use it for like video games. It's just a chatting thing, right? And they post stuff up, and there's a bit of like you're in the club or you're not in the club if you're on it or not. So yeah, I guess, but I think the actual concept of like having a device in your pocket around you all the time, where you can watch like this mindless shorts and stuff like that, I think the longer you can kind of delay that, the better. So yeah, so I'm kind of agree with you, but I think there's some tougher realities at play as well.
It's so tough, right? And I think that our generation is acutely aware. Put it this way: when I was growing up, and I'm starting my schooling in Australia, my parents were from like Malaysia, right? And all this technology didn't exist. Their frame of reference was so different. And so when I went through school, I just really struggled with that connection around like why it was important to fit in. But I feel like we understand, or our generation understand that a little bit more. So we're like a little bit more sensitive to that social aspect as well, right? Like that whole line of, if your friends don't like you because of the shit clothes you wear, then they're not your friends. It's like that whole line, right? Like I think that's very easy to say, but when you're going through it, it's much harder to do. My real thing is that how powerful of a device you give them, right? Like, say if you, and this is where the monitoring comes in. So say if you gave them a phone, but you severely limited some of the apps, would that be an approach that is more advisable?
Yeah, well, most of the phones now, they have some sort of family thing. Actually, just that's the other thing too. Just was going to say, like, having a phone isn't that novel for kids because now, like, adults get a phone every 2 years, it seems, and so there's so many hand-me-down phones. you almost have to kind of find a good reason not to give them your secondhand phone. Sort of thing like that. That can be the reality of it. Like, and you hear so many stories about, they've got their dad's phone or something. But let's go back to basics and go, is spanking an acceptable form of discipline?
I want to try to find some space for spanking, but no. I think that if you are kind of like getting to the point where you think spanking is an effective technique, you well and truly have passed the point of no return, I think. And that's not to say that I think anyone who uses spanking as a technique is a bad parent or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. I just think that it's a method that is not necessary. It's not like a vegan thing where it's like, there are some benefits to meat. It's like, no, it's like, I feel like there are no benefits to spanking that you can't replicate with other parenting other discipline or connection techniques. So that's a no for me.
Okay. Well, I agree with you, but I'm going to build on it. So first I'm going to ask you an extension question, and then I'll give my views. Do you know anyone of our age or younger that uses spanking on their children?
Yes, I do. And I know two different parents that use it, and they use it for very, very specific reasons to kind of signal to the world that they're traditional, right? And that they won't be told, that they won't succumb to the world, the government, people outside of their family unit telling them what to do. I believe that is a huge, huge part of it, right? And they don't do it to like physically hurt the child. It's like is a signal to them that consequences, of their actions kind of thing. And it's like, it's more of like even like a mental state they put them in. They see it as no different from forcing your child to do anything against their will, right? Which I think when you look at it like that, there's a certain truth to that as well. Like if you make them, so when I've challenged my friend about it, they say, well, have you ever tried to like give your kid a timeout? And so there's no difference to doing that. They do not want to take that punishment. You're making them do that, right? That is against their will, and if you think the difference is that I'm hitting my child to cause some kind of pain reaction so they associate to it, then no, I'm not hitting my child hard enough for that to occur. So that's kind of like the line that they give back to me.
I must admit, I'm quite surprised that, because I don't know anyone who does that, so I'm quite surprised that these people sort of still exist. I don't doubt that they exist.
Well, you do live in a more hippie area.
But it does, actually, like, this is not quite related, but it just made me think of this. Have you ever been in a situation where you can just tell that there's like either a single, like, well, when I say single parent, I don't mean that they're single as in they're divorced or something, but just they're on their own with young kids, or it could be a couple together. But usually it's like there's one parent on their own who can't handle the kids. It could be that they're the less effective
Hello, Daddy.
of the two parents. Yeah, and actually, no, I got to say, I tend to find it's mums that in this example that I'm thinking of, where they're in a supermarket or somewhere like that, and their kids are just going wild, absolutely wild. They're screaming, they're running around, they're picking shit up, they're putting stuff in the butt, like, and they're just totally uncontrolled. And actually, it's not that the kids are necessarily badly behaved or anything like that, but they're just a bit out of control, right? And then what happens is, like, the parent who's in that situation is very visibly and very vocally saying, like, stop doing that, don't do that, come back now, put that back, but in a very sort of kind of loud way, and like but the kid just isn't listening. The kid's just doing what they're doing, and then what's worse is the parent doesn't follow through with any additional consequences, and so you can just tell like that nothing's going to change here, because like that, yeah, they're saying like this very vocal instruction to the child, But the kid's just not reacting. They're just not doing anything different. They're not following through with any like consequences. So of course it's like running riot. And if that's how they like parent, you can tell like why this is a shit show. But like my theory is that they're only doing that really loud, like, be quiet, stop running around, come back down, put it back. Not because that's them doing anything, like they genuinely want their kids to do anything different, but because they want to like broadcast to the entire shop that, see, they're a good parent. They're taking like disciplinary action. They're telling their kids to stop causing chaos. So it's a show. It's a show for the rest of the shop, right? And
interesting too.
It just makes them look like such bad parents.
Oh, I got a lot of questions. I mean, I feel like what you're describing is like the bogan mother yelling like, Jason.
Oh yeah, totally.
You know, like that kind of style of like, put it down or I'll fucking smash his. But I do think that what I've seen, so I have seen that. I've seen that plenty. But I've also seen a version where the dad's useless. Like the mothers are doing their best to try to like work with this child and put some discipline, and the father's like totally checked out. Like just like the kid's tantruming or like causing a ruckus, and he's just not doing anything, right? And then maybe eventually he'll like take him away. So I've seen that model as well, and I've also seen the one where probably less popular these days, but the mum's very much like, oh, wait till daddy, like don't make me go get daddy kind of thing, and there's like a good cop bad cop situation, and then you know dad comes storming in with a loud voice, and the kids are a little bit scared kind of thing. So I've seen that model as well, and they're all kind of dysfunctional in their own way, but yeah, I think it is tough. And actually, like something that I would throw in the mix is that by the time your kid is in a public place and is losing it, you've already lost, because you don't really want to, like, they've got you, they know, and sometimes they know they have you because you're in a public place, and you can't really deal with it always in the best way, because sometimes you need privacy to do it properly away from judging eyes, right?
So back to spanking, my view is that, like, and I've read all the stuff, or at least I probably haven't read it myself, but I'm aware of the stuff saying that, you know, there's no real benefit and there can be some harms and all that. But yeah, I do just wonder, is spanking a little bit like fasting, where there's very little evidence actually to say that fasting helps you on a diet. Like it doesn't really help you in, like, yeah, you might reach this point of like ketosis or whatever, but it doesn't help you lose weight faster really. But yet it's still effective because it just stops you from eating, right? And so you take in less calories if you're fasting. And so spanking a little bit like that, where if you are of the nature of a parent who would be willing to spank their child, that you are in other domains a bit more firm, a bit more solid, a bit more robust, that you establish the kind of guardrails that kids need in a positive way. It's not the spanking that gives the positive benefit, but it's maybe a philosophical thing, where if you're someone who isn't, you know, melting it, we're going weak at the knees, you know, for kids and the things that they say, that you may be actually a better parent in some ways.
Yeah, I think it's just I agree with what my friend was talking to me about, where there's actually no meaningful difference, apart from one key one that I would argue that actually spanking can be done a right way and a wrong way. But I think the problem is, once it's on the menu, there's no stopping the kind of connotations with this idea of physical discipline as being acceptable, and that gets you into a dark place, you know, this idea. And like when my parents talk about being physically disciplined, you know, they're not often always talking about getting the belt from their parents. They're talking about getting the belt from like their school teachers and getting the cane, right, at like churches and stuff like that. So this is how it used to be back then, and they understand, this is not a good thing because they went through it.
All right. So how should parents, this is number 5, how should parents react to a child's poor report card and you're not allowed to say spank them?
I'm fighting against some of my urges, and I think this very much does depend on the child and how much self-discipline that they have internally, and how much kind of drive they have internally. But I do think that acting like it doesn't matter at all is, which some people kind of subscribe to now, I think is a mistake. I think that it is like a boundary, like anything else, that perhaps you set a level of expectations. And I think that the X factor here is much more, it's like, oh, the result doesn't matter, son. It's the fact that you didn't try hard. Like, I'm actually more disappointed that I knew you could have done better, right? And I think that's like the modern style. But it all starts with some kind of reaction and setting expectations on how grades should go. So I can kind of see the value in that, right? But I'm also speaking someone who is carrying a little bit of scar tissue or trauma or whatever the trendy word for it is, of someone growing up and having their parents put a huge amount of pressure on academic results, right? An unhealthy amount of pressure. And obviously you don't want to perpetuate that. So it's hard when you swing. You got to make sure you don't have a counter correction.
This is too hard to answer, I think, because it really depends on the situation. It depends on the age. It depends on the reasons why they're not as good as you would hope it would be. It could be poor, but it could be better than the last one. In which case, it could have been really poor the last time. So, I think a poor report card is more a symptom rather than the problem itself. So to me, that's more a symptom of like a kid who's like disengaged, who's not taking school seriously, who maybe has a learning difficulty, who maybe is getting distracted in class. So it's more a symptom of a problem rather than the problem. So I think what you should expect as like the default, if everything goes to plan, is an average result. So if they're above average, you go, oh sweet, okay, I don't have to worry about that. If they're below average, that might still be okay. But if they're well below average, that's when it's a problem that you have to diagnose, and the solution depends on the reason.
Yeah.
And
wow.
It's not as simple as just, you've got to really act in this really aggressive way, because it just depends on the reasons and the context.
This is the bit I'm struggling with. Even listening to you say that, I'm quite triggered. This idea that the kid you should shoot for average, be happy that they're above average, and only react when they're below average.
No,
I think that is a different, like, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, Andy, but the reason it's triggering me is because that is not the culture that I have experience with. And I do find myself going into that space more, which then you have this inner conflict sometimes as, ex-rehabilitated tiger parents or whatever, that are you actually denying your kids the same things that perhaps gave you some benefits, right? In terms of your upbringing. And so where is the scar tissue justified for the outcome, right? And it's also very easy to think that way when perhaps like people are already innately academic, if that makes sense. So if like perhaps your academia has come fairly easy to you compared to your children, that is also an added complication, right? Because you feel like you didn't have to try, you didn't have to be pushed, but perhaps maybe like you said, all kids are different, right? And
well, I think average. Okay, so maybe address the concept of average first. Like average has become synonymous with bad. Like it's average, or you went to a restaurant. How was it? Average. Like that's not a compliment. But statistically speaking, like someone's got to be average, right? And above average is actually good. Like it is actually good. It means that you're better than more than half of the people out there. So above average is actually good. It's not something to scoff at as a bad outcome. But just to maybe be a bit more precise, I think when you're talking about younger kids, and I've only got one kid and he's in primary school, when you're looking at the kind of milestones that kids need to meet in primary school, average is literally just, yes, they've ticked the box, they're at development mentally where they need to be. They're not falling behind. They're not going to suffer when they're at high school because they've missed some, they can't read and write or something like that. So average just means that they've met the things that they need to meet to allow them to succeed. It doesn't mean that they necessarily, like if they're above average in primary school, doesn't mean they will necessarily succeed in high school and vice versa. So that's when I talk about it in that context, that's how I would think of it. When it comes to like, say, year 9, 10, 11, 12 in high school, like before you're contemplating those final years before they're, going to university and it would shape the rest of their life. That's where the side of parenting where you want to do the best for your kids, you will probably look at your child and you'll say, yep, you are someone who is capable of going to university. You're switched on, you're smart. You should be doing the best that you can do. And you should be pushing them. It should be your advice to them should be to encourage them and instill in them some kind of aspirational motivation to do the very, very best that they can. But equally, I think it is a mistake to think that you're going to motivate them, that your will is what's going to motivate them. It really has to be their own will. So I think your focus as a parent shouldn't be on telling them they must do this or they're in trouble. It should be on saying, no, here's the reasons why you should work hard, and try and help them understand where you're coming from, so they get it. And and the other scenario might be you might sort of know that your kid's not up to it. I mean, kids are all different. If you've got a kid who will be going and doing a trade because that's the better pathway for them, you might approach it differently. You might be talking about what are the options there, and becomes more about, don't be a slacker, be a hard worker, be committed, go get a trade, set yourself up. So it's different. It's horses for courses.
Totally. But again, it's this thing of like, in the Asian culture, you are forced to do things right in a traditional sense, and there's this idea that your elders know better, and you'll thank me when you're older. And a classic thing is like, being tortured into learning piano or violin or whatever. And I know plenty of people that absolutely hated, myself included, as we were going through it. And then the people that did stick with it or whatever it was later on in life, they do definitely appreciate it. So it is, again, this really tough dynamic there, because I do agree with you, but there is a part of me that thinks, like you do appreciate some of these things later, being forced to stick with things, right? As in terms of an upbringing and the idea of like, the pressure from your parents and your environment. It's like you may not understand that as a child, but later on you do reap the rewards either way.
All right, this is a good one. Number 6. Should children be allowed to skip school for mental health days?
All right. This is going to get me into a lot of trouble. And I think this is going back to the original, Abigail Shrier's book, right? Like, I think that if your child has like a certain type of condition that is impairs, we're talking like big tier stuff, right? Like schizophrenia or dissociative disorders and things like that. I'm not talking about that, but I am talking about a time, if you're as a teenager, you do go through periods of elements that feel like depression, but maybe not in a clinical sense, anxiety, social anxiety, all these kind of things. I think this is what she's talking about, right? Like, I think that we've been given the clinical language now to really jump at these shadows, right? Like, just because your child feels disappointment lack of drive, things, depressive symptoms, they feel social anxiety. Like some of that is part of growing up. Like some of that is part of having to go to school and dealing with like the realities of the quad. And no, I don't think that like engaging in this kind of idea that like you have to take a day off to recover is a good thing. And I think actually there are studies that actually dwelling on some of these things actually make it worse when you're going through these development periods. Now, you got to keep the lines of communication open. This is very, very different from like bullying and other things like that. But yeah, I think that you need to, not every negative emotion is evidence of some kind of clinical diagnosis. And that's all I would say.
Roger. I'm very disappointed in you. You went way too soft. Oh, hell no. No kid should ever be able to skip school for mental health day. I'm sorry. This is the worst thing to have emerged in the last 5-10 years.
That's what I said.
No, but you're like giving it caveats and all this. Oh, maybe in this situation. Like, fuck no. Hell no. This is... Mental Health Day is synonymous with what we used to call what used to be known as chucking a sickie, right? This kind of language is what is enabling this kind of thinking that if it's too tough to go to school or face whatever challenge you have, you just take the day off. Just don't go. And that is not the way to approach life. That is not how to instill a resilience in children. And if the moment you give kids a story that all you have to say is you need a mental health day and you can take the day off, they are going to be taking the piss like you'll never believe. Like, and I have a very close to home and close to my heart experience of this. So my son this morning didn't go to school, or today didn't go to school. And the reason was because he had a sore throat. And so I said to him, well, look, sometimes you still have to go to school. I'm not saying you don't have a sore throat. I'm not doubting it, but I think you're okay. I think you're okay to go to school. And then he told me that, oh yes, but his teacher said to the class, if you're sick, stay at home. Like, because apparently kids were coming in sick, and it's very like, I was thinking, why on earth did that's the worst messaging to be giving to kids. Give it to the parents, right? If the parents are sending their kids into class with, and they're all sick and coughing and all that, then yeah, okay, send a message to the parents, say, hey, come on, keep them at home. But don't tell the kids. Don't give them this this like language to just basically take the day off whenever they want. So I'm a big hard no to a mental health day. And if kids do have other more serious kind of like clinically diagnosed situations going on, even so, they should go to school. But like seriously, like I think it is a genuine question if this is like 10 steps in the completely wrong direction.
Oh, Andy, if only the parents of the Bowling for Columbine kids kept them home for a mental day, where would we be? The reason I'm careful with any
they just would have done it the next day.
Mental health thing is that you want to kind of make sure communication's there. And I agree. In most cases, this garden variety stuff is not quite there. But yeah, I stand by my comments.
I think just to, for anyone listening at home, wondering why we're so harsh on the concept of like a mental health day, it's not so much that we're disputing, or I can only speak for myself, but yeah, it's not so much like from a place of disputing mental health as something we should concern ourselves with. It's more just that the notion that every single person should have a mental health day every now and then is what's taking the piss, right? Like the norm should be that most people don't need a mental health day. And I hear people talk about the concept of taking a mental health day, and what they mean really when they say I want to take a mental health day is that I was tired, or I was playing computer games last night and I really don't want to go to work. Like that's what they're actually talking about. And that's not good. So Next question, question 7. Is it necessary for children to do household chores?
No, I don't believe it is. I think that it's like a very transactional thing that occurs, and it rarely translates, in my experience of it, to the kid learning that they're doing it for the right reasons, and they may pass it on in terms of a practice from when they have their own kids, but it won't, like taking the garbage out every Tuesday night is not going to fundamentally change values on that, in my opinion. And in fact, the people that have been pushed too far in that direction, I feel, carry that with them. So, like, I'm thinking of, stories of like, when I grew up on the farm, I had to chop the firewood every day. And I still remember like how heavy the axe was, and I couldn't break it, and there was no, and there was no help that was given to me or afforded to me, even though, like the axe was half the size of me and all this kind of stuff. Like, I think that when it comes to that kind of stuff, I don't know that it's totally necessary. It could be, in terms of giving your kids some responsibility and feeling included, but I think that it's more just like for the parent to feel like they're doing, they're starting to give the kid a bit more, doing the right things, but perhaps not having a huge impact at the end of the day.
I can't really answer this in a like philosophical way. I have to probably just reflect on real life experience, which is that we're a little bit lax with chores and requiring him to do chores, predominantly because I think it's actually quite hard to get your kids to do. Like, it's like someone used to do that you do all these things to get your pocket money or, things like that. But you do need to like get on their back to do it. Then they don't do it like the way it's meant to be done. And then you've got to do it again, or you've got to do it with them. And even if you teach them how to do it properly, it very seldom happens that way. So you actually need to like invest quite a bit of effort into doing that, I think, or at least you have to either that or you lower your standards. It's just like one of those things where short-term pain, long-term gain, like we've never been able to endure the short-term pain, I guess. So, but I get the reason why some families would do it though, like why they would push it and why they would prioritize it.
There's a difference between the scheduled kind of like chore to get your pocket money compared to just like asking your child to help you because you're doing something. Like I wouldn't tolerate that they say no to that. But I'm talking more about the stereotypical, like, mowing the lawns and getting $5, right? Or taking the garbage out every Tuesday, and that's something I did growing up, those kind of like arbitrary things. And I think that it just teaches the wrong kind of value and reward system. You should be able to say to your kids, help me tidy up this room, help me clean the barbecue or whatever. And it's not an argument. They do it because you've asked them to, not because it's like their responsibility and they're getting paid for it.
Final 2. Is it okay to get your children drunk? I mean, is it okay to let your children have a sip of wine or beer if they are curious to try?
All right. Obviously, how young are we talking here?
Your kid comes up to you, says, "What's that?" You say, "Beer or wine." And they say, "Can I have a try? Just to see what it tastes like." So they're, I don't know, 7, 8 upwards.
Yeah, a sip's fine, for sure. I had a sip of my dad's VB, I think when I was like 7 or something, and it was the most rotten tasting experience. I can still remember how disgusting it was, and in a way it was good. It was good to kind of have that first experience with like an adult beverage and like realize, okay, this is definitely an adult beverage, right? Like this is not something that I want at this point in my life.
Yeah.
So I think there are some benefits, and that's not going to, like, I don't think that anyone can say that that's detrimental to a child's health. I think maybe there's a secondary issue around attitudes towards alcohol that I am sympathetic to, and I don't think you can be truly sympathetic to it unless you probably experience someone in your life or circle that does have that problem. But yeah, I think it can be done in a very, very innocent way.
Yeah, I think it's more fun, a bit of fun, right? It's not like they're drinking and getting drunk. Like it's that
we're not Italian.
It's a novelty, right? It's like, oh yeah, have a try, see what you think of it. Oh yeah, that's disgusting. How do you eat that? Yeah, I think it's
It'd be like the same
harmless.
as letting your kid take a drink out of your coffee, right?
Yeah. All right, last one. Is it beneficial for children to participate in highly competitive sports or activities?
It would be no surprise to you that I strongly agree, or I strongly acknowledge the benefits of competitive sport, but I am also very sympathetic to kids that are pushed into that arena against their will, and there's absolutely just no joy for them, right? I played competitive tennis when I was a lot younger, and I loved the game of tennis until I had to compete at a certain level. And I think if you talk to a lot of people who play quite serious competitive, maybe not like obviously like amateurs, but getting quite serious, right? Not just like your weekend player. Sooner or later, they'll tell you a similar story that actually it lost its magic, it lost its fun because it became so much pressure. And I think that for that reason, I am sympathetic that it can be quite unpleasant. But I think the most important thing about sport is this idea of like a simulated competition in which you lose regularly, right? And I think that's the name of the game. That's the name of the game. Being a good loser. If you can deal with that idea that I'm not always going to win. There are times where there's nothing I can do, right? Like I can try my absolute best or whatever it is, and I'll still get my ass beat, right? And I think that is very hard to get in other areas of your life, you know?
Yeah, so I think it's good until it's not good, and then it's really bad until you become a millionaire because you're Rafael Nadal, sort of thing. Like, I think that the trajectory is like, I think it's good to try and like push yourself and like achieve something. And not just sport, like any domain where you're mastering something and you're benchmarking yourself against other people, and you can say, yeah, I'm doing well and I'm actually better than most of the people I'm engaging with, or at least I've developed a sufficient level of competency at this that I recognize that in myself. I think that's good for like self-esteem. And the reality is most of us, what we do tend to do is we tend to do something, pick that thing and do that thing and get good at it. And then we stick with it, and then that encourages us to do more of that thing. So most of us do have something equivalent where we've mastered something and we're better than most people at. And if we're not good at it, we don't continue with it. And so most people do have that thing, have something like that gives them some sense of self-esteem and pride. So I think it is a thing that is good. But I think what is not good is when it crosses over to being the focus of your life, where you're not concerned about other things in your life. You're just concerned about being really good at whatever that activity is. And that's when it actually becomes really bad, because, I mean, there's so many ways that you could sort of talk about it being bad, but even just not realizing that this thing that you think you're good at is actually totally unimportant in life, and that you missing all the other things in life that you could be good at, and that actually, even if you're just moderately good at it, can actually help you be successful in life. Like, it's quite distracting. Like, makes me think of, I don't know if anyone's seen the latest Fargo series, but in this Fargo series, the latest season that was out, earlier this year, there's this guy, and he's like total leech on his wife, and he's like a golfer, and he spends tens of thousands of dollars on all this equipment, and they've got all these bills racking up, and she's like a police officer, so they're not like necessarily high income, and he doesn't work because he's got to focus on his golf swing all day, and he doesn't make any money. He's just a dead shit loser, but he thinks he's like just on the cusp of being like a pro golfer, and he probably is a good golfer, but he's not good enough. And that just, to me, sums up this whole problem in a nutshell, right?
I met lots of people too, right? Like, I think growing up around tennis, sport is no guarantee of developing some of these more admirable qualities of being a good sportsman and being a good loser, a gracious winner and a good loser. There's no guarantee of that. And in fact, I met lots of people, like tennis brats, that would be just the competitive nature made them terrible people, right? Really like sore losers, really vindictive, do anything to win. And you know the feeling when you meet someone who is overly competitive, right? And it's this weird thing that, like, Australian culture, being a sporting culture, a sports-centric culture, encourages this idea of being a competitor. And being competitive is seen as, like, quite a good thing. But, man, like, when you meet these people and they're just, like, all over you, like, because they're just very competitive, and they're rife in the workforce as well for obvious reasons. It's you can tell, you know, like, some of it's very maladaptive.
All right. Well, I think we've answered it. Who's the worst parent? Me or you?
Look, the only way to answer that is to ask our kids that are in therapy in a couple of months.
That's unfair. You get to choose. You get to choose